Dog and scissors. What would you do if one night you're reading a novel by your favorite author and suddenly a criminal bursts in and bam? By accident while trying to help someone, you end up dead. However, immediately after, you are reincarnated as a little dog who is adopted by none other than your favorite author, who, unfortunately for you, loves being with scissors. Well, that's what Dog and Scissors is all about. Let's get started. The anime begins with our waifu, who is peacefully writing in her notebook while her little dog is reading a book. Out of nowhere, they start having a somewhat strange conversation that escalates into a fight with scissors, showcasing the girl's bipolar humor. However, this story actually has a backstory, so we flash back a couple of days ago, where we meet Kazuhito Harumi, a high school student obsessed with reading in solitude to the point of living surrounded by mountains of books. Kazuhito is a rather antisocial boy who only talks to the workers at his bookstore, and to make matters worse, he has a fictional love affair with his favorite novelist, Shinobu Akiyama. She is described as one of the best authors in almost any literary genre, but despite being a genius, no one knows anything about her personal life or her interests for future works. However, all of this would change one day when we see that while the young man was peacefully reading his novel in a cafe, the place is robbed by an armed criminal. In an act of heroism, he stands in front of the thief and shields a beautiful girl who was being threatened, receiving the shot that sends him straight to the afterlife. During his astral journey, the young man cares little about witnessing his life passing before his eyes, since he only regrets one thing for all eternity: being unable to read Shinobu's next work. It is here that fate gives Kazuhito a second chance by allowing him to reincarnate into the body of a dachshund and be taken to a pet store by a friendly Afro guy. Days go by, and he slowly adjusts to his new body and, in essence, his new life. However, at some point, he becomes a bit depressed and sentimental from spending so much time without reading his beloved books. After a week, one morning, Kirihime Natsuno appears, a girl with excellent scissor skills, and despite seeming somewhat suspicious due to her abilities, she ends up adopting the little dog and taking him to her basement. Once there, we learn that the waifu, besides having sadistic tendencies, a completely twisted sense of humor and quick hands, also has the power to read minds, which allows her to understand what other people feel, or in this case, what Kazuhito thinks. After a few strange and merciless jokes, the boy realizes that the woman in front of him is the same one he saved in the cafe incident, and in return, the waifu offers him a place to live and unrestricted access to her personal library. While they converse for a while, Kirihime surprises us by revealing that she works as a novelist under the pseudonym Shinobu Akiyama, and leaving him in awe. Now, in addition to having the opportunity to read all the works he desires, he will be living with the very author he admires so much. At this point, the protagonist of the story will truly have to adapt to this new style of mood swings and days filled with work. But before that, at the girl's request, they go to Kazuhito's old apartment to see what useful things they can find and thus close that chapter. On their way to the location, our protagonists encounter some rather curious characters, from the pet store guy with the afro to an idol, who for some reason doesn't seem to have a good relationship with Kirihime. Nevertheless, after a few hours, they arrive at Kazuhito's apartment, where through pure deduction and the connections of the waifu, they want to search the rooms. The only place where the thief can hide and not be found is in one of these storage rooms, as we recall that during the incident, the crook stole the young man's wallet along with his key and credentials. In the end, their assumption was correct, because as soon as the guy hears a noise in the next room, he runs out and leads them straight into a trap. It turns out that all this time, this guy was busy reading Shinobu's works, and in the process, memorizing the fighting techniques and attacks described in each of the stories, thus creating an opponent worthy of our girl. Well, that's what we thought, because after a good beating, she simply takes out her scissors and with two moves leaves him half dead. Kirihime leaves the guy ready for the little dog to take his revenge for what he did in the cafe, but he decides to do the opposite and saves her life, confessing that deep inside his heart, he can see a lover of literature. Perhaps in the future he can become a better person if he follows the right path. The waifu, very angry, reproaches him for the decision he made, confessing that she feels guilty for being the reason that caused his death, and that's why she wants to avenge the person who once saved her life. The protagonist knocks her to the ground and in a reflective manner tells her that she shouldn't feel that way, because ultimately he only did what she would have done for anyone else. Thanks to the way she writes her books, he was able to see through her and truly understand her personality, concluding that from now on, his thoughts will live safely in his heart. With this, the girl starts crying, and later that same day, as they head back home, Kirihime confesses to Kazuhito that she is starting to develop romantic feelings for him. However, since this is a new sensation for her, she isn't sure if this feeling is real or just a passing fancy. Nevertheless, the protagonist messes it up by making an inappropriate comment, quickly changing his waifu's loving attitude to that of the crazy scissor lady who chases him around the neighborhood. thus beginning their true new life of madness together. In another scene, we see a girl offering food to a family altar with a picture of our boy, and quickly we transition to a scene where we see him as a husbando version, that is, when he hadn't met his demise yet. Here, his little sister, Harumi Madoka, enters his room to wake him up and let him know that breakfast is ready, but out of nowhere, the shadow of its owner appears behind her, threatening him with scissors and scaring him so much that he wakes up from the dream. After calming down a bit and realizing that it was just a nightmare, the protagonist starts to feel quite concerned because he hasn't heard from his family in a long time, but all of this fades away as soon as he lifts his head and sees an albino woman sleeping in the living room of the apartment. Kazuhito approaches with some fear to see who it is, and after having a conversation in which it seemed like she could also read his thoughts, he eventually realizes that she's just a bit eccentric. After a few minutes, Kirihime enters the room and introduces us to Susanna Hairaji, her editor, who was there for a meeting about her upcoming novel. Here, the albino woman tells Shinobu that her work is garbage, to which she calmly responds that she already knows because she has been lacking inspiration to write good stories for a while. As the protagonist witnesses how this lady gradually destroys the ego of his favorite author, it becomes apparent that the two have a somewhat peculiar working dynamic, as it seems Susanna enjoys the pain she causes to her waifu. In other words, she's a... Before leaving, this strange woman warns them that there are strong rumors about a psychopath roaming the neighborhood, which sparks some interest in Kirihime, who later confesses to the protagonist that since his arrival, she hasn't had a trace of inspiration but knows he's not the center of the problem. Nevertheless, the next morning, the albino woman makes another appearance, but this time with fresh news about the crazy stabber. After devising a plan and gathering courage, the couple decides to search for the criminal, hoping to breathe new life into their surroundings and inspire the waifu. However, in the midst of their investigation, the blonde girl appears once again, introducing Maxi Akizuki, one of the authors who is direct competition for Shinobu. Apparently, these two have a certain rivalry based on the genres their works are based on, and they have been looking for each other for a duel. But for several months now, Kirihime has done nothing but ignore her, or they are simply interrupted by the security guards this idol has. Setting that aside, later that same day, the protagonist comes to the conclusion that all the victims of the psychopath are people who buy his owner's books. But before they can fully develop their idea, they are interrupted by a loud noise coming from the shopping center. Once there, we see that the easygoing Afro guy was affected, and in addition to that, amidst the crowd, our girl manages to spot a suspicious person. Without hesitation, she goes after him, leaving her little dog alone and defenseless. After a while, we witness how the innocent Kazuhito is kidnapped and taken to his old room, where for some reason, his little sister recognizes him despite being in his animal form. We go to a scene with our waifu, who eventually lost track of the suspect. However, the good thing is that in the middle of the street, she finds a clue that might be useful for them later. Back with the protagonist, we see that despite the girl seemingly understanding what he says and engaging in a somewhat conversation, Madoka is actually a little disturbed. The impact of losing the only family she had left was more than enough to cause a nervous breakdown, leading her to believe that the dog is her brother. Although the young girl is right and she even tries to offer him some curry to prove her theory, our boy refuses to eat it completely. Based on previous experiences, he knows that dish is inedible. Meanwhile, the decides to go out and buy a couple of missing ingredients. Kazuhito notices that an intimidating Kirihime has been watching him through the window all this time. As expected, this situation triggers jealousy, combined with her side, compelling her to take the dog away and ask him a few threatening questions about his After the protagonist explains and manages to convince Kirihime that he was simply by Madoka, the waifu decides to change the subject and show him the clue she found during the chase with the suspect. They have a conversation and reach the conclusion that the stabber must be someone who holds a strong grudge against Shinobu. Kirihime immediately thinks her sister is the main suspect, but Kazuhito manages to stop her and makes her reconsider before she does something foolish. Nevertheless, the next morning, the couple returns to the streets to continue their investigation. Suddenly, Susanna arrives and informs her boss that a rumor recently spread about a person destroying their books in the middle of a park. With this new information, they both decide to go and see what clues they can find. Once at the location, our detectives come across Madoka herself, who initially wanted to fight. However, after the protagonist pleads with her and asks her not to harm one of the few important people left in his life, the waifu simply asks her one thing about the burned books and leaves without a trace. Later that day, Kirihime tells her dog that her sister probably considers them as the cause of her death and the destruction of her works. Furthermore, considering that in Kazuhito's list of priorities, Shinobu came first, followed by his family. This results in an uncontrolled hatred towards someone who is merely working behind a pseudonym. With this in mind, the protagonist asks his owner to please help him confront the monster he has created. Surprisingly, she accepts without hesitation, as it seems she was always aware that Madoka would eventually find the house of the mysterious author. Keter, the disturbed girl, confesses to us that thanks to the hidden tracker on our boy's collar, it was quite easy to find the hiding place. Therefore, the waifu has no other choice but to tell him to his face that she is the woman he has been searching for all this time. After confronting her about stealing all those precious moments with her brother and hearing the part of the story where Kazuhito is in the cafeteria while saving her life, the cunning girl decides to the animal again and jump out of the window. After a few hours, we see in the park as Madoka confesses to the little dog that the pain of losing a loved one is what drove her to desperately search for him. But now she understands that he is gone and she can't keep carrying that burden forever. However, things get a bit tense when Kiriem arrives at the scene and the two start fighting, revealing the tuna hunter, which is basically a giant multi-purpose knife she supposedly wants to use against the scissors Hazajiro. They fight for a while. The crazy girl transforms her weapon into various tools. She even uses the bazooka mode to stop our waifu, but all her attempts are futile, as she is clearly inferior. After the fight, the two of them have a conversation and ironically become friends. Here, Madoka clarifies that she is not the rumored and that when it comes to why she burned the books, she simply did it based on a recommendation her brother gave her some time ago. Finally, the protagonist realizes that the true stabber was always right in front of him, as it turns out to be none other than Susanna herself, who later confesses to the little dog that this whole spectacle was meant to help her boss find the necessary motivation to write better works. However, to their surprise, Kiriem falls from the sky and confronts her editor because apparently she always had control over her movements and from the beginning knew that the killer was just a show to support her with her creative block, which doesn't make much sense since she had overcome it several weeks ago. To top it off, she shows them all the drafts with fresh ideas that Susanna will have to review from now on because Shinobu Akiyama is back and more determined than ever. The next morning, as the couple accompanies Madoka to the train station, our waifu gives the young girl permission to treat the dog as if he were her brother because despite appearing somewhat sadistic, she actually has a very kind heart. Minutes later, the crazy editor solves the mystery of the killer's whereabouts, finally putting an end to the investigation and the stabber scandal. Later that same day, we see poor Kazuhito being treated like a servant dog. He is frequently sent to Sakura's store on behalf of his owner to buy certain books they need for reading or to find inspiration. The real problems start when Yaoi, the younger sister of the store manager, secretly tells the protagonist that this might be the last time they see each other since they are moving to another city in a couple of weeks. Worried, the boy shares this information with his owner, who initially doesn't pay much attention. However, after hearing the story about how this bookstore holds sentimental value for him as the first and only place where he felt accepted by others and even made a few friends, she starts to feel a pang of concern that she might be able to do something to prevent their departure. In any case, the next day, the protagonist returns to the store and witnesses a fight between the two sisters. Yaoi then takes him in her arms and leads him to a nearby playground. Here, the little girl confesses that the business is on the verge of bankruptcy, and if things don't improve in these last few days, they will have to close the store forever. Innocently, she sets her plan in motion to promote the bookstore using the dog as a promotional mascot. After walking through the city streets for a while, briefly encountering a jealous Kirihime because of all the photos of the dog on the internet, and running into Maxie, who only manages to make the little girl sad, they return to the same part from the morning. Despite the protagonist's numerous attempts to cheer Yaoi up, it is once again our waifu who comes to save the day. She confesses that thanks to the tracker on her collar, she was able to find him easily. Since she is here in the middle of this problem, she decides to lend a hand to the little girl and take her back to the bookstore. Once the two sisters reconcile for the morning's inconveniences, Sakura explains that it was all a misunderstanding. She reveals that they are not closing the store and the constant arguments between their parents are simply their strange way of showing how much they love each other. In the end, Kazuhito tries to thank his owner for helping him resolve this situation and for giving him the opportunity to live by her side, but as always, the sentimental moment is cut short when poor Kazuhito has to run again to avoid the sharp scissors of Kirieme's punishment. Several days later, on a seemingly calm afternoon of reading for the protagonist, things take a somewhat murky turn when his owner asks him for the strange favor of helping her find her lost. The young man has no choice but to accept and begins to sense the essence of the waifu, but she misinterprets his intentions and dismisses him with a single swipe. Fortunately for him, Susanna arrives as a replacement for this mission, giving him the perfect opportunity to escape and return to his books. Both of them go to the gym, supposedly the last place she saw her underwear. However, since they couldn't find it, they decide to train together to pass the time, all the while continuing to ponder where the lost item might be. Upon returning to Kazuhiko, it is revealed that the had been under his blanket the whole time. Upon recollecting his memories, he remembers that the previous night he was rummaging through the clothes to find a small blanket to keep warm and inadvertently took his owner's as well. Fearful of her violent reaction upon learning this, the little dog decides to find a hiding place for the evidence to avoid any trouble. However, Kirihime has already anticipated his actions and is simultaneously searching for it, suspecting that he is somehow involved in the whereabouts of her underwear. The protagonist attempts to dig a hole in the middle of the park, but gets completely distracted when he suddenly spots a beautiful maid dancing in the plaza. Here we meet Sachi Moraib, who quickly notices his presence and promptly transforms her broom into a weapon, triggering an intense pursuit. It nearly ends in disaster when, while trying to dodge an attack, the young man impulsively jumps and narrowly avoids being by a truck. Fortunately, our waifu arrives just in time and, performing some impressive acrobatics, manages to save her defenseless companion. She then prepares herself to confront the person responsible for the accident, but the maid puts a stop to the confrontation, sheaths her weapon, and departs to continue her duties as a servant for her still unknown employer. With the situation calmer now, Kirihime discovers the evidence in Kazuhiko's backpack but chooses not to say anything. Amidst it all, we notice that there is a seam on the clothing in the shape of a dachshund, which he interprets as a sign that if he acts cute and adorable, he can avoid punishment for lying. However, the opposite occurs and he is once again chased by his owner's sharp scissors, completely oblivious to the fact that an unknown person had been closely watching them. Putting this aside, sometime later, the little couple goes to a hot springs inn, which, as it couldn't be any other way, is called the Holy Land of Swords because literally the decorations in the place are all weapons. And just to top it off, they also surprise us by bringing Madoka along on this trip since she was invited by our waifu, who wants to strengthen her bond with her future sister-in-law. Before entering the room, the protagonist notices a somewhat suspicious pink little book but doesn't pay much attention to it because even more shocking is the fact that Kirihime has her own room in this complex. In her room, there are not only many scissor decorations and sharp objects but also a few photos of her childhood or her family tree. After the crazy girl tries to sneak the animal into the place where they will stay and has a slight argument with her sister-in-law, all the girls meet up in the hot springs to enjoy a relaxing bath and chat for a while. While each one talks about life and studies, we can see that being accompanied by so many people is partly a disadvantage for our waifu, since it doesn't allow her to spend time with her husbando and complete the whole list of activities she had planned in the pink notebook. Even Susanna and the mysterious man stand in her way, and to top it off, even Kazuhiko himself shows no interest in spending any time with his owner, which means problems are starting to accumulate in the plans of our young couple. The next morning, in an attempt at a date around town, it so happens that Maxie is in the same place as them for some reason, but as usual, they simply ignore her and head to the store Kirihime is looking for. Once they arrive at the place, it seems like everyone decided to go on vacation as well, since the maid also went to the same store to buy a sharpening stone. Although the moment is quite brief, the two manage to have a normal conversation for the first time, but once again, the maid has to leave at the request of her mysterious boss. Later that same day, while they were on their way back to the inn, the waifu comes across the same place that was responsible for taking their family photos some time ago, so they take the opportunity to enter and take another one to preserve this moment together. Now back at the inn, the protagonist realizes that something doesn't quite add up in the place because from the beginning, he has noticed that the staff there acts a bit strangely in Kirihime's presence, which she has also noticed. However, she decides to put it aside and go to the hot springs to sharpen her scissors with her new dragon stone. At the same time, we see that for no apparent reason, all the workers enter some kind of trance, alerting Kazuhiko, who rushes into the showers and warns his owner about the dangerous situation. It is at this point that the waifu reveals to us that she had experienced the same thing before and that all these people are actually a group of who only seek to harm her. The only problem is that Hazajiro, her scissors, are dull, so fighting under these conditions would be like giving away the fight. However, both her little dog and Madoka come into the picture and give her enough time to fix her weapons and finally start the real ball. After some impressive moves between Kirihime and her sister-in-law, they both emerge victorious, but not without completely destroying the pink little book that the girl had prepared with so much dedication for this trip. In the end, the inn had to close the next day for repairs, and as our little group heads back home, we see in the distance that the mysterious man is once again watching them, but more importantly, the couple promises to return to the hot springs at another time, only this time they will go alone, showing us the lovely photo they took just hours before the incident. Weeks go by, and we find ourselves in what appears to be a normal day. To start the morning off right, they go out to buy a few novels. They acquire a new work by the author Hotaru Fujimaki, and as usual, the mysterious guy follows them closely everywhere. Up until that point, everything was going well, or so he thought. On the way back home, the protagonist instantly realizes that someone had been in the apartment during their absence. Thanks to his perfect control of the bookshelves and books, he easily recognizes one that is out of place, coincidentally the same one they bought at Sakura's store a couple of hours ago. After carefully examining the work, Kazuhito notices a slight resemblance to Shinobu's style, to the point where even the author herself acknowledges that Hotaru's novel shares a similar method of expression. With this in mind, the detective duo resumes their investigation and starts digging into the mysterious writer. However, all their attempts prove futile as they can't find anything about this person on the internet. As a last resort, the waifu reaches out to the eccentric Susanna, who surprisingly has some relevant information about the suspect's whereabouts. Once his hideout is located, they agree to a meeting and head straight to confront him. As expected, all of this turns out to be a trap to lead them into the hands of a group of which ultimately doesn't work out well since Kirihime, with her impressive fighting style and using her poor little dog as a projectile, effortlessly defeats the thugs. After a few minutes, the mysterious man reveals himself, and we finally meet Shuzen Osawa, the leader of this gang and Hotaru Fujimaki's father. Consequently, he was also the one responsible for breaking into the apartment and leaving the extra books on the shelf. After a murky interrogation, Mr. Osawa confesses that this entire spectacle was at the request of his daughter, who apparently is a big admirer of Shinobu. However, her father completely opposes our waifu, considering her a bad influence on his little girl. Furthermore, we also learn that the attacks were actually the doing of this sinister girl, and the poor old man had nothing to do with it. He only wanted to help her fulfill her dreams. The detective duo manages to obtain an address where they can find Hotaru, but upon arriving at the location, they discover that her hideout is in the protagonist's old school, which is suspicious from the start. Before continuing the investigation, Kazuhito makes a stop at the library to retrieve a manuscript he had hidden when he was a student at this high school. However, amidst the darkness, he notices a shy girl who seems to hide more mysteries than her quiet personality suggests. To better understand this situation, we have to go back to the time when our boy was human. One day, while he was peacefully reading, he came across a book that he unconsciously began reading aloud. After completing it, he realizes that this work belongs to the young girl with depressive tendencies, Hami Osawa. Feeling embarrassed, she apologizes for wasting his time with such a silly thing. In response, the protagonist, standing tall, asks her to please finish her novel so he can find out the ending of her story. Eventually, she agrees, and weeks later, she completes the manuscript. Although it is not perfect and bears a striking resemblance to Shinobu's style, it is good enough for the girl to continue on that path and fulfill her dream of becoming a famous writer. They keep the work in a place known only to them. In the present day, despite the young girl not understanding what the animal is saying, she interprets that she is standing in front of her only friend from back then. Hami reveals that she is indeed Hotaru, and her pseudonym, besides being a wordplay with Kazuhito's name, is also a reminder of the promise they made some time ago. Apparently, the girl's goal is to defeat Kirihime, not physically, but in a literary duel. To her surprise, Kirihime accepts the challenge, initiating a competition. In short, the challenge consists of being the first to complete a 100-page manuscript. As expected, our waifu corners the poor novice, who, despite attempting various writing techniques, falls short of Shinobu's power. When she runs out of tricks, she decides to resort to her ultimate method, Bryonak. This method involves manipulating readers mentally through specific keywords, allowing her to control people and give them precise orders, such as the group of harassers, or in this case, making her rival want to harm herself. However, intellect surpasses despair as Kirihime effortlessly completes the sample novel, barely winning the writing challenge and leaving Hami devastated. Putting this aside, Kirihime tells the girl not to give up on her dream of becoming a successful writer. She advises her to first focus on improving, revising, and completing the incomplete manuscript she had left behind. Additionally, if she wishes, she can learn a bit from Kirihime, thus starting a new relationship between teacher and apprentice. This also helps her understand how the Bryonak technique works and how she can use it with the protagonist to fulfill her twisted desires. Later that same day, Madoka visits our couple's apartment, and as expected, the crazy girl insists on preparing a curry that Kazuhito might like, since he never enjoyed the taste of her cooking, even when they were real siblings. Despite briefly seeming like the girl had finally made something worthwhile upon seeing the strange blue appearance, she decides it's best to escape to her favorite library. After spending a few peaceful hours observing Sakura's kind treatment of her customers and, above all, her ability to cater to each person's tastes as they enter her establishment, things take a turn. Out of nowhere, Maxi's bodyguards arrive at the store with the strange request to purchase every last book by the mysterious Momiji Himhagi and our beloved Shinobu. The protagonist decides not to remain in the dark and begins investigating what they want with all these books. However, on his way, he coincidentally encounters the maid who attempts to attack the little dog again, but this time his owner is more vigilant and arrives just in time to rescue it. After a while, Maxi appears in a helicopter, revealing herself as the one responsible for emptying all the bookstores in an attempt to eliminate her direct competition, oblivious to the fact that this actually benefits the young writers, as money is money in the end. The conceited blonde challenges Kirihime to participate in a writing contest, which in simple terms involves writing 9 stories for 9 different judges. Once they decide on a winner, that person will be crowned the best novelist in the world. Saki becomes angry with Maxi because in her eyes, the only one worthy of being considered number 1 is Momiji, who, all this time, turned out to be her boss. Just when it seemed like the 3 of them were about to engage in a fight, the bodyguards enter the scene and take the little girl away to continue working on her pending matters, leaving everyone yearning for a good brawl. After this whole waste of time, the protagonist returns to his favorite library, only to be surprised by the news that both Sakura and Hami will be entering the same school. To top it off, Madoka also makes the same announcement, claiming that this is the best way to continue her little brother's legacy before he passed away. This news surprises Kazuhito so much that he unintentionally gives himself away and ends up being forced to eat the crazy girl's curry, except this time he has to stomach a dish that resembles rainbow. Sometime later, our couple receives an unexpected visit from Susanna, who is initially completely ignored. However, when she mentions that it is about time for Shinobu to make her official appearance in the media, it catches the attention of the waifu. To better understand this situation, let's go back to the beginnings of Kirihime, where, upon the recommendation of the company, her public identity was kept secret. At that time in the story, she was simply a girl who wrote exceptionally well and created stories that captured readers' attention. However, her publishing house now believes it is an opportune moment for the young girl to make her grand debut and stay on par with her competition, such as Maxi or Momiji, and occasionally interact with her fans with a... At this point, only the little dog was paying attention, as it seems that this idea doesn't sit well with Kirihime, who prefers to ignore them and continue working on the drafts of her new story. Susanna seizes this opportunity to start working on the outfit her boss will wear at the upcoming book signing, treating us to several scenes of impressive cosplay at super speed. Just before her eccentric assistant dresses her in a school swimsuit, the waifu stands up and makes it clear once and for all that she is not willing to reveal her true identity. However, what she didn't expect is that this was part of a plan to create a distraction and slip some alcohol into her coffee, hoping it would help convince her to accept the proposal and incidentally add a bit more violence to her editor. The problem here is that the opposite occurs, and to our guy's surprise, his owner now takes on a more loving and innocent demeanor, resulting in a serious misunderstanding. Kirihime not only starts dreaming about the wedding ceremony she wants to have with her loyal dog, but also plans their honeymoon and the future family they will supposedly have. Kazuhito begins to feel uncomfortable with this new side his owner is showing him because he is not used to receiving so much love from her. At one point during the night, they almost end up sleeping together with intentions of engaging in activities, but the romantic moment is interrupted by a physical reaction to the excessive amount of alcohol given to them by Susanna. In the end, nothing happened, and the waifu woke up the next morning as if nothing had occurred, even suggesting that the poor dog smells. After the end credits, we get an epilogue of our protagonists talking about the same old things, how our dog wants to read the conclusion to the series' Lust and teases that the flat-chested sadist should hurry, thus initiating a chase where we can see once again the now normal life normal of our protagonists. What an ending!